Colleagues, thank you very much for joining us again this afternoon. I'm very pleased to have been asked to chair this session. My name's Jenny Corbett. I'm from the Crawford School, and we have a terrific lineup of speakers this afternoon. Stephen Howes, the Director of the Development Policy Centre here at the Crawford School, and I was instructed that I was not to give introductions to them because they're in the booklet, so I won't spend precious talking time doing that. The second speaker is Jianguo Liu, and he has told me, as I struggled to pronounce his name in a not too embarrassing fashion, that actually he can be called Jack. So that welcome from Michigan, which is fantastic, is also my alma mater, not Michigan State, but Michigan University. So, and then Tom Kompas, our own director, talking about fisheries policy. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Stephen to begin the proceedings.
Okay, thanks a lot, Jenny, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for staying through. I noticed we've got a lot of people sitting on this side of the theatre. Easy access to the door. But I'm very grateful to Veronica, I'm not sure if she's still here, but for starting a discussion on aid, because I was a bit unsure as to how we'd go from the very big topics we were discussing, future of the world, the G20, superpower rivalry, food and health, to a topic like aid. And I've got to say, sometimes at Crawford, when I tell people, that's what I work on, say work on aid, I feel like I'm a doctor, kind of a conference, and you introduce people are the cancer specialist and the brain specialist, and I'm like the specialist on the appendix, right? So it's something that it's pretty small, maybe it used to be useful once, we're not quite sure to when or to do what, and probably doesn't have much of a future, And that's how aid can seem, but aid is what I do. I've worked in the aid industry most of my working life, and now I'm an academic, and a lot of my time is spent working on aid. And I don't want to sell you on the importance of aid, but I do hope you'll find that it's an interesting topic. And it is a little bit invisible. Perhaps we do underestimate the relevance of aid. I was, surprised how often it came up in the presentations, not only Veronica's presentation, but in the health presentation, or we talk about food security. And of course, this whole conference is sponsored by AusAid, and this institution is really, it's kind of an aid success story in some ways. And some of the countries in this room get a lot of aid. Aid's very important to them, the smaller countries of the Pacific. And even if you look back at the very successful countries of Asia, you can still see aid playing a role, whether it's institutional innovation in China or helping Korea, when it was a fragile state, get through that. So let's not forget about aid, but let's have a look at it. So, there are some big questions in aid. One is, does it work? Another one is, what's the future of aid? That's very uncertain. We have very conflicting signals about the future of aid. But the question I'm going to look at today is how to make it work better. And, I think that's a good question because, yes, there are, good idea. It's a question that's important because there is a lot of aid, and it started to fall off. DAC aid with the recession has started to fall off. But if we look at non-DAC aid coming from China and other countries, we see that increasing. We also see a lot of NGO aid around. So even if the future of aid is very uncertain, I think we can be confident that there's going to be a fair bit of aid around. And I also think it's an interesting topic because it's one that hasn't been looked at as much or as in depth, or perhaps I should say systematically, as the other topics. In fact, what you find there's a lot of aid advocacy. There are a lot of people out there who have got the answer on how you should spend your aid dollar. Right? And they tend to be economists. And here are the top three. Right? And you've probably all heard of Jeffrey Sachs, Bill Easterly, and Paul Collier. So Jeffrey Sachs says that extreme poverty is a trap that can be released through targeted investments implemented as part of, that means through aid. Right? It's a trap that can be released through aid. We have to harmonise. That's a bit of aid jargon. We also work together. If we work together, we can get countries out of the trap through aid. Right? Bill Easterly, big Sachs critic. Right? Aid cannot achieve the end of poverty. Right? I think that's the title of Sachs' book. Right? Don't try to fix governments or society. Instead, Easterly's not actually, he's an aid critic. He's not against aid. Use aid to do things that are useful for individuals. Right? concrete things like supplying vaccines, antibiotics, food supplements. Right? And then Paul Collier from Oxford, often seen as sort of intermediate, right? Kind of the voice of reason between the two extremes of Sachs and Eastleigh. Aid's part of the solution, right? To help turn society to the bottom billion around. Collier has a special emphasis on fragile states, right? The bottom billion. And what should aid do? It should be assessed by its ability to promote reform, right? So aid should promote economic reform, right? But it's pretty confusing, right? It's not that easy to actually situate these three authors, right? If we look at ambition, yes, Sachs very ambitious, Eastleigh not at all for what aid can do, and Collier's in the middle, right? We look at harmonisation, whether aid agencies should work together or separately. Yes, Sachs all in favour of it. Eastleigh's against it because he wants all the aid agencies to be accountable. Collier may be in the middle. But if it comes to governance, right, it's the other way around. Actually, Collier is on his own. He's saying we should use aid to promote reforms, right, sort of thing Veronica was talking about. Whereas Sachs and Eastleigh saying no, right? We should use aid to provide public investments. So my aim for today is to present a general framework for understanding the determinants and strategies of aid effectiveness. Now, to help us situate these different advocacy agendas and to understand the trade-offs between them. There are lots of limitations to what I'm going to say. One, of course, is the time. And I'm going to go quite quickly through a lot of the slides. And you might find some of what I say a bit provocative and perhaps not founded in evidence, and I hope you'll ask me in that. And there is work that I hope will back up what I'm saying, but I can't present it all today. Even with that caveat, there are, of course, inherent limitations. I'm only looking at aid from a development perspective. Of course, aid also has strategic objectives. I'm not going to look at whether it achieves its strategic objectives. I'm only going to think of two types of aid. Aid that's used for governance and aid that's used for sort of everything else. You think of it as aid for roads. Of course, a lot of time in aid is spent, we should spend it on roads or we should spend it on nutrition or education. I'm going to kind of take all that together and just look at that basic choice, aid for governance and, for example, aid for roads. Right? And it's a framework. It's not an answer. I've got a few sort of some attempts at an answer, but it's by no means a full answer. It's much more of a framework. So what is that framework? Well, it's very simple, and it's a principal-agent framework. And I'm sure a lot of you know this, but principal-agent frameworks are used for problems where one actor, the principal, wants to achieve a goal, but can only do so indirectly through another actor, the agent. And that agent can't be directly controlled, but only influenced through incentives. Right? And so we use principal-agent models across the kind of disciplines that Crawford's involved in. In economics, we look at an employer as the principal and the employee as the agent. But in political science, you can look at voters as the principal and governments as their agent. And I think that the principal-agent framework fits well in the aid. Right? The aid is the principal. The donor wants to achieve objectives but can't do so directly. Instead, the donor has to work with or through the recipient host government to achieve those outcomes. It doesn't mean the donor is more powerful. Principals can be very weak. Right? Look at voters compared to governments. It doesn't mean the donor has to give the money to host government, but it does mean one way or another the host government influences aid outcomes. Of course, it's a bit politically incorrect, right? Because we're all meant to think of aid as partnerships and we're all equal. But it can still be a partnership, but analytically, it's a principal-agent framework. And I use this to actually teach my course, so I can see some of my aid students here, and you can fill in. So this is the aid scene. You've got donors. Donors run projects. Projects are intermediated by governments and they produce outcomes. And of course, domestic governments are also subject to other domestic interests. And if we simplify that, here's a simplified form. So aid is a combination of funds and conditions placed on host governments to achieve actions. And so we can use this, I mean, here I've called it a model. I should call it a framework. It's not a model, actually. We can use this to situate the different reform agendas. So the first one is looking at the host governments are the weak links. The reason why aid and indeed development's not effective because the host governments are not up to the job, right? So we should focus our aid on getting the host government to work better. And I've got for each of these a slogan, and here the slogan is it's institutions stupid, and that's because, as John Williams said, recognition of the importance of institutions was perhaps the key innovation in development economics in the 1990s. So perhaps development economists are a bit slow in that, but it does go to the discussion we had with Professor Haggard, and of course we would say, well, of course the BRICS have lower, easy doing business, that's why they're poorer, right? Weaker institutions. But if institutions are so important for development, then institutions are going to be important for aid, and that's been recognised as far back as 25 years ago by donors themselves, as that second quote shows. So that's the first approach, and as you'll see, that's the one associated with Paul Collier. Second one is donors are the weak link, right? So here, why doesn't aid work better? It's not because the agents, not doing well. It's because the principle is not working effectively. And this one's a bit less obvious because, of course, if institutions are important and donor agencies are from rich countries, they should be good, right? They should have high institutional, because rich countries have high institutional quality. So why would this one be the case? And that's the slogan, it's not easy being an aid agency, right? And I know that. And just to bring that home, compare the task of an education department to an aid agency, right? An education department will just work in one country or even a region within a country on just one sector, right? And they'll have lots of people with lots of expertise of that sector and that area. In fact, they probably grew up in that area, right? But the aid agency will work in many countries on many sectors. They'll have experts, but they'll be spread thinly, right? And they won't have that implicit cultural knowledge often, right? Education department has really well-defined goals, aid agency vague goals, aid agency low ability of funding to achieve goals, many, many choices, right? Education department, do I focus on more teachers or more textbooks? But the aid agency, do I focus on higher education, lower education, scholarships, nutrition? There are so many choices that an aid agency makes. And finally, and most important, the education department, the beneficiaries are very close, right? If your teacher doesn't turn up to school, they'll complain, right? Whereas for aid agencies, the performance feedback loop is broken, right? The beneficiaries don't vote in the country that's giving the aid. And the third one is aid transactions as the weak link. And here the idea is, well, so far, we've just been looking at one agent's donor, one recipient, but in fact there are many donors, right? And they get in the way of each other, they've got many, many projects. Too many cooks spoil the broth, right? So this is the official kind of reform agenda, saying the problem's not with the donor or the host government, the problem's with the way they interact with each other. And that also has some common sense. It's been long recognised, and I just highlight, because we have a number of people from the Pacific, and we have Ron Duncan here, he gives us a good example of this from 2007, where he was asked to do a study of economic governance, and he's found that country officials were overburdened with visits by staff of international bilateral agencies. Basically, they weren't able to do their job. They were all the time meeting consultants. And in fact, we heard from Rick Ho something similar just yesterday from the Solomon Islands about how it was good to get support from the World Bank, ADB, AusAid to prosecute economic reform, but he was so busy meeting them, he found it hard to advance the reform agenda. So each of these three lines of attack have some good justification behind them. And each of them have well-developed strategies that you can follow. Now, I'm just going to have to glide over these, but the sorts of things that we're looking at here, I'm just going to pick out a few that have been tried and tested, is technical assistance. Australian Aid does a lot of that. Conditionality. Right? These are ways to try to improve, have an influence on institutions, right? Or you can try and pick the countries that already have better institutions. If you want to, that's the, if you think the government's the recipient government is the weak link, that's the institutional lens. If you think the agency, the donor agency is the problem, the key thing is to make the agency more accountable, more independent and rigorous evaluations, the sort of thing Veronica was talking about today. But you can also try to reduce the knowledge burden, right? Work on fewer countries, fewer sectors, do things that are simple. They've got enormous discretion, so try and reduce the discretion of aid agencies. And then finally, if you want to reduce transaction costs, that is the Paris Declaration agenda. And so just focus on the first two. Right? Harmonisation is donors cooperating with each other, and alignment is extending the club to include the host government. So that's my framework. That is how to improve aid effectiveness. And these are where those three popular prescriptions fit in. Right? Collier is about improving the institutions of recipient countries. Eastleigh is about making donor agencies more accountable. And the Paris Declaration, Jeffrey Sachs, are about harmonisation and alignments. All right, so that's the framework. Very quickly, I want to suggest to you that this framework can help us identify the limitations and the trade-offs between these different aid reform strategies. So first of all, the limitations of the institutional or host government approach. Institutions are key, that's what we've learnt, but what purchase does aid have on institutions? Right? Institutions respond slowly, and mainly to domestic factors rather than to international donors. And in fact, I think one generalisation we can make is that aid for governance is least successful where it's most needed. Now, we've got new methods all the time. We're now, we've given up a bit on conditionality. We've gone on trying to support civil society. Perhaps that will be more effective. Perhaps that will have a, likewise, sort of mixed record that the other instruments for addressing institutional reform have had. What about the Paris Declaration? I think, again, it's got something going for it. The underlying principle of partnerships is an important one, but it's actually been tried and failed. Right? We've tried to do this as a donor community, and the evaluation last year showed it didn't work, and that's not surprising because key donors have got reservations about this. And recipient governments also often don't play their part. Alignment only works if the recipient government is a strong government. It doesn't work in a fragile state. And in the end, it's unrealistic to look at the way donors and governments interact without looking at the incentives that they face. Then finally, the limitations of the aid agency reform approach. I think the positive thing about this is the one strategy that should work in all aid environments, right? Whereas the others are better suited, I've suggested, to good governance environments. But the geographical disconnect, which is the ultimate source of aid ineffectiveness, can never be changed. Right? Aid recipients will never vote in the countries that give their aid. And do we really want to prioritise aid accountability over all other aid objectives, even if it means enormous transaction costs, because everyone wants to work by themselves so that they're accountable? When does aid accountability become aid paralysis? So my argument is that while all of these three have their strengths, they all have their limitations, and we have to look, therefore, across all three of the columns. We can't think, yep, that's fine. We can't think that we can look just at one of the columns to get the answer. So what happens when we look across the three columns? Well, I think one bit of good news is that perhaps for different reasons, but everyone agrees on the importance of selectivity. Right? So whether you look at it because you want to work with governments that have got good institutions to start with, or because you want to have a lower knowledge burden on donor agencies, or because it's a good way to reduce transaction costs, is for each donor to do less, selectivity comes out as a winner. So I mean, if there's one mantra, I think, to repeat to that the academic world can repeat to the aid world, it is on the importance of selectivity. And then there are a few other parts of the aid reform agenda that are relatively non-controversial. If you look across the columns, they don't directly contradict something that's in another column, right? And they're the ones that I've circled here. But I want to go on, they're not the 3 or 4 that I highlighted as being associated with Collier, with Easterly and with Sachs, which are the sort of the key reform proposals. And the main point I want to make here is that the key reform proposals are contentious. There is a trade-off between, on the one, the Collier agenda of trying to improve the institutions of aid recipient countries, and the Easterly agenda of making donor agencies more accountable. And there is a trade-off, again, between making donor agencies more accountable and the goal of reducing transaction costs. And these are what I call the impossibility theorems in aid, right? That aid is either transformational or accountable. So, of course, Veronica proved me wrong just now by giving an example of a sort of aid for governance where she'd actually done a randomised control trial. And so you could actually see whether it worked or not. But that sort of situation is very rare. And governance reform is often countrywide. It's often very long-term. It's often subject to multiple influences. And the sort of instruments that we use of imposing conditionality or putting an advisor in place, we can never randomise. And we can at best guess whether or not they've had any impact. So, changing institutions is not very observable, right? So therefore it's hard to hold agencies to account for it. And then the second one is that aid is either harmonised and aligned or it's accountable, right? And that's simply from the idea that if you pool effort, then each person pooling effort, each person contributing to that pool is less accountable than if they were exerting effort by themselves. It's harder for us to grade a team assignment than it is to grade individual assignments. And I give credit to Bill Easterly because at least in his writing he does hint at these trade-offs rather than glide right over them. But where I part company from Easterly is that Easterly then says, let's forget about transformational aid. Right? Let's forget about trying to influence governance because we won't be accountable. Let's forget about coordinating, because that will lead to what he calls a cartel of good intentions. Right? To me, the arguments for focusing solely on the aid donor accountability agenda, as dear as they are to my heart, are not so overwhelming that we can forget about the other strategies and make such an easy choice when it comes to these trade-offs. So, to conclude, this has been a kind of a wide-ranging presentation, somewhat abstract, but I hope I've shown you that it's useful to think of aid effectiveness in terms of three groups of determinants: the donor, the host or the recipient, and the transaction costs, right? And strategies to influence each. Beware of both single and across-the-board aid reform agendas. Right? No single aid effectiveness agenda obviously dominates. And what I mean here by across the board, that's sort of a mea culpa. I mean, I have participated in several aid reviews, and it's very hard in an aid review to make explicit the trade-off. You tell the aid agency to do everything, right? To work on governance reform and to be very accountable, right? And to cooperate with all other donors. But in fact, when we reflect on it, there are inherent, unfortunately mostly unrecognized, trade-offs between common aid effectiveness agendas. In terms of the research agenda, I mean, the fact that I think no one strategy dominates means there's plenty of scope and need for aid research. Although, on the other hand, I think it's going to be very much a case study kind of research effort, which is good for accountability and learning, but I would potentially limited returns because I'm not sure even after another 5 years we'll be any better at being able to generalize what does in fact make aid work better. Thank you.
Stephen, thanks. That was an amazing survey. I feel like I've taken your entire course in 20 minutes. It's great. And I said I wasn't going to introduce any of the speakers, but I think that's for the home team. I think I should at least introduce a little bit our distinguished guest who's come from overseas to join us. And Jack Liu is the Rachel Carson Chair in Sustainability and the University Distinguished Professor of Fisheries and Wildlife at Michigan State University. And his bio is absolutely intriguing, so I'm really looking forward to hearing him speak because his research deals with the integration of complex human environmental challenges with social science. So I guess he's working in the complex systems sort of area, which I always find deeply difficult and interesting. So Jack, please come and enlighten us.
Thank you so much for the nice introduction, and thanks to Tom for the invitation and your associate for organizing such important and timely conference. I come from Michigan, as pointed out, and this is 2 o'clock in the morning in Michigan. If I fall asleep during my talk, wake me up, please. Okay. Many excellent points have been made about China. So what I'm going to focus on is sustainability issue in China and in the telecom world, and I will explain a little bit what this means. And talk about social economic sustainability, but I will focus on environmental sustainability due to the time constraints. And from the Center for Systems Integration and Sustainability, by systems integration, we mean integrating these different disciplines in social sciences, in natural sciences, and the policies. And this is, I think, consistent with the aim of the new journal and the aim of the new society. And what I'm going to first talk about is a conceptual framework, and which some of you already have been working on extensively on the interactions within human systems, how humans interact with each other, and by social scientists, right? On the other hand, many people, including ecologists, have been working so hard on the interactions within natural systems, like ecosystems, how animals interact with animals, how plants interact with animals, and so on and so forth. And also, increasingly, people have been working on how human societies have impact on natural systems, okay? how human influence natural systems and the environment. And then on the other hand, some people have focused on how natural systems, like natural disasters, affect the human systems. Okay. So what we and my colleagues and I have been proposed is a new framework, which called coupled human and natural systems, which are integrated systems in which humans and natural systems interact. There are feedbacks, how humans affect the natural systems and how natural systems affect the humans, besides the interaction within human systems and the interactions within natural systems. And this, just to talk about one system, but also, as many pointed out, there are a lot of interactions over distance. So in natural science, there are concepts like teleconnections, which are environmental interactions between natural systems over distances, like climate change, okay? Like the climate in one place can influence the climate 1,000 miles away, okay? And on the other hand, globalization has been a very popular topic by social scientists. Talk about socio-economic interactions between human systems over distances. So what we call telecoupling is both social, economic, and environmental interactions between coupled human natural systems over distances. Like China could be treated as a coupled human natural systems. Australia could be treated as another coupled human natural systems. And this is a conceptual framework. Talk about telecouplings between China and the rest of the world. Okay? There are many examples of telecoupling. Trade has been widely discussed, although trade has been mainly focused on social economic interactions, but also there are a lot of environmental interactions which have been ignored. And also there are other examples like technology and knowledge transfer, species invasion from one country to another. Okay, that cost billions of dollars of economic loss. And the human migration also have impact on both the receiving areas and the sending areas. And this also the migrant animal species from one place to another. Tourism and water transfer from like North water transfer program in China, 1,000 miles apart. Okay, from the southern part of China to the northern part of China to meet the water demands. And investment for development and for conservation program and air circulations. Okay, so those are just some examples. Talk about China, and this a table highlights some of the indicators where China is placed. And as you can see here, China is placed first among many of the indicators, okay? And only second in some of the places, okay, like the total GDP. And, but if you look at the environmental sustainable index, this China is placed 133rd out of 146 countries evaluated, okay? So there is a big challenge there. So not just China is placed high in many categories, but also the phenomenal growth in population size and the GDP over the last 3 or 4 decades are just remarkable. Okay. And also, China is very limited by resources. Here is a table listed per capita resources in China compared to the average in the world. Okay. If you look at the forest area, for example, it's just 1/6 of the world average. And the fresh water is 1/4 of the world average. And if you talk about grassland and cropland, and those are just less than 1/2 of the world average. And also mineral resources is less than half of the world average. Okay. But on the other hand, pollutions, air pollutions, water pollutions, and water shortage are big challenges in China. And out of more than 500 cities evaluated, only about 21 cities reaches the highest air standard. Okay, that's less than 4%. And the same is for the acid rain. You know, more than a quarter of the country is suffering from acid rain. And the water shortage, more than 400, or out of more than 600 cities are suffering from water shortage problems. And also the eutrophication, and all the lakes, and half of the lakes are under eutrophication. And also, if you talk about the impact on people, okay, this is not just the impact on the environment, but also the impact on people. More than 430 million people are breathing bad air, okay, in the urban areas. And in the rural areas, more than 300 million people don't have good access to clean water, okay. So those are the very devastating impact. And then the wastewater released is still continuing increase over time, okay. But you talk about CO2, climate change. This is one figure that's showing the dramatic increase in the CO2 emission and energy consumption, okay. But if you look at the biodiversity, what kind of impact, what kind of factors affecting biodiversity? China is one of the main biodiversity countries in the world, but there are many factors affecting biodiversity, and biodiversity loss is really remarkable. So there are many positive factors, but also many negative factors affecting biodiversity, and cause habitat fragmentation, species loss, and extinction. And you can look at this. There are some good factors listed at the top, green color indicator, and there are also many negative impact on biodiversity. And then mostly they are increasing over time. If you look at this from the established of New China in 1949 to up to now, you can see this intensity of impact has been increasing over time. Okay. And then if you look at the natural reserves for biodiversity, this is really a very phenomenal growth over the last 2 or 3 decades. More than 2,500 nature reserves have been established, including more than 60 nature reserves for giant pandas, the world famous endangered species in China. And about 15% of China's territory is now considered nature reserves. Okay. And on the one hand, China has increased investment in water conservation, and but on the other hand, China's increase of use of fertilizer has been increased as well. So you have this positive, negative impact to interact with each other. So, and then the export and imports are growing this exponentially in China, and then this has a dramatic impact in China on the environment and also the world environment. So I'm just going to give you one example about CO2 emission. So China is ranked #1 in terms of total amount of CO2 emission, but research indicates about 1/3 of this total CO2 emission was produced due to products produced for export to other countries, okay, in 2005. And also, trade caused a lot of loss for water. Water is already in great shortage in China, but due to trade, and China lost about 23.5 billion cubic meters of virtual water. Virtual water means the water used to produce products for export. And they are not the real water exported, but the water contained in the process of production. So China also have environmental impact on other countries. And one of the examples is that China is now the top importer of tropical timber from tropical countries like Malaysia, like Indonesia, and other countries. Also, China is become bigger and bigger importer of agricultural products like food. We talk a lot about food security, Okay, how to ensure the food supply for Chinese people? That's a major issue. Now China has become a importer of agricultural product. In the past, China was self-sufficient in terms of food, and like soybean and meat from Brazil. Okay, that really have big impact on tropical forest and also grassland in Brazil and other countries. And this kind of impact is due to the implementation of new conservation policies in China. And the two listed here, one is called Natural Forest Conservation Program, which provide incentives for farmers and the foresters and to protect the natural forest by not logging the natural forest area. Another big program is called the Grain to Green program in China, which give farmers incentives and subsidies to convert the cropland into forest land. Okay, so here is the map show the distribution of these two programs. The green areas may indicate those provinces have been implementing these two programs, okay, both programs. And the yellow means only the Grain to Green programs, and those other areas with no program. You can see mainly the vast majority of the countries have been implementing this program since late 90s and early 2000s. And as a result, inside China, the forest cover has been increasing. Okay, and that's, I think, is good news. But on the other hand, we needed to consider the export of deforestation in other countries. So when we talk about policies, there are many recommendations. Here I just list a few. Here one is to promote close international collaboration. And because China is part of the world, and there is a great need for this kind of collaboration. Secondly, China have developed a lot of hundreds of policies and laws, but the implementation has been lacking. Okay, so there is a great need to improve and implement those existing policies and laws. And coordination among different policies, different agencies and the sectors is a great need because, and even for water management, for example, there are more than 10 ministries responsible for water management, but they are not coordinated. So there is a big need for this kind of coordination. Also, water management for agriculture, for industry, and other sectors. And there is a great need for coordination too. And also, it's necessary to monitor the environment and the socio-economic change simultaneously. Okay? Because if we just monitor environment change, ignore the socio-economic change, or just monitor environment, socio-economic change, but not environment change, then we will miss the boat. Okay? And the integrating social sciences and the natural sciences, and they inform the general public. One last point I want to give some more detail about pay attention to the household proliferation. This morning we heard about the nuclear proliferation. Here I use this proliferation as a word to describe the rapid growth in the number of households. And people have been talking about population growth a lot. You hear, you always hear China is the most populated country. But if you look at the household numbers, that's really remarkable because household number has been going much faster than population size. Okay, if you look at this chart here, over any period of time, you can see household numbers growing much faster than number of people. Okay, the population size. Households are the basic socio-economic units, consumption unit and production to many areas, and also the basic unit. So, but we have not paid much attention to it. Another thing is that even in some regions, some areas, the population size, human population size has been declining, depopulated, but the number of households continue to increase. Okay, so that's very important phenomena to notice. And this is because the household size has been declining over time. Okay? Not just because of the family planning policy, the one-child policy, because if you have that policy, you not just decrease the number of people in the household, but also you decrease the number of households too. But here, the household size decrease is due to many other reasons besides the one-child policies. Okay? And the divorce is one of the reasons. Okay? In the past, it was really rare to see a Chinese couple get divorced. The families, the friends will convince you not get divorced if you want to consider that. Okay? But now it's become quite common. Okay? So in 2006, for example, about 2 million couples get divorced. Okay? And actually you can get divorced now within 5 minutes. You just fill out a form, do that. So here is a diagram show that if you maintain the same level of household size at the level of 85, then the household, how many fewer households China could have. Okay? So this is the actual household size. Okay? So by 2000, if you maintain the same household size at the level of 85, then China could have 79 million fewer households. And if you continue to maintain at that level, by 2015, China could have more than 200 million fewer households. Okay? So that's a big number. That's about two countries in equivalent to U.S. The number of households. The number of households in the U.S. is about 100 million. So you could save 2 U.S. in terms of number of households. So these kind of issues are beginning to get attention, but not in the policy arena yet. A few years ago, my colleagues and I published a paper in Nature. We got a lot of media attention, and including newspapers, mainstream media, like New York Times, Washington Post, and ABC Australia, right? So those TV program, NBC, so on and so forth. But one magazine that I was totally unexpected is called the Divorce Magazine. So called me to see, why Divorce Magazine interested in what we are doing here in terms of environment. If you look at the title of those reports, you can see why. And spend 2 weeks on the phone or in front of TV, talk to the reporters, and I got tired. But once I got see their reports, I was really relieved. I could not do anything as good as what they have done. So here is the first one, okay, what they have there. Divorce has not only children, but also the environment. Okay, this is the second one. Okay? How many of you are living alone, right? It's bad for the environment. And this is another one, population aging. Okay, a lot of old people living by themselves after the children grow up and move out. Okay, this one I particularly like, especially for young people. Okay, so third planet, live with mom and dad. Okay, so this is just an illustration how important the household proliferation is in terms of environmental impact, in terms of other consumption, and so on and so forth. And how to serve the environment is really need to take place at the household level. Let me just quickly summarize what we just discussed. Yeah. And China's sustainability is influenced by the rest of the world. In the same time, the rest of the world is also influenced by China. But no research has quantified this kind of impact. So there are a lot of research questions to be addressed. Okay, so how much impact has China has on the world, and how much impact the rest of the world has on China's sustainability? So how to address those kind of issues, right? So will something China is doing influence the rest of the world? I think that's a very important policy issues as well. And in China, some aspects are moving towards sustainability, okay? But many others are not. And like a forest recovery. But even that has consequences to other countries. And deforestation in other countries probably contribute to the forest recovery in China. Okay? And right now, the negative forces affecting sustainability are much stronger than the positive forces. Okay? How to minimize these negative forces and enhance positive forces? I think it's not just a research question, but also has important implication for the policymakers, for not just the people in China, but also people around the world. So thank you so much for your time.
Jack, thank you very much. Divorce Magazine, I had no idea. Fantastic. The final speaker is our own director, Tom Compass, to talk about what else but fish.
Great. Thank you, Jenny. Those were two great presentations, so thanks, Jack, and thanks, Stephen. I'm not going to be as entertaining, I guarantee it. That was really quite good. Actually, Jenny, before you start the clock, let me just make one preliminary remark. I would normally not have myself on a program that the Crawford School is hosting. I feel a little bit embarrassed about that. So apologies, especially to my Crawford School colleagues, for taking this valuable talking time. I'm here because our Pacific friends wanted to hear this story. AusAid funds quite a bit of my work on tuna in the Pacific, and they do also fund our New Society. And also, my good friend Marie Tate insisted that I do this, right? And you all know, the locals will know how tough Marie is, so thank you, Marie. So this one's for you, Marie. Okay. Also, one other preliminary remark. Much of this work, it all started with a publication that I think was accidentally accepted in Science magazine. It was the establishment of a new target for fisheries that was conservationist, unheard of by economists. And since then, I've had a lot of really good co-authors work on this, and much of what I'm talking about is drawn from those good people. Long Chu, Pham Van Ha, Quentin Grafton, Ray Hilborn, Dale Squires, and especially in the early years, New Chi. So thanks to all of them as well. This is a story, of course, about fish. Everyone loves fish. But what I want to do is I want to focus on one of the Pacific's most valuable resources, the Western and Central Pacific Ocean tuna fishery. I want to talk about how to harvest in that fishery, and in particular, I want to talk about the current practice of adopting a so-called maximum sustainable yield harvest target compared to a target that we prefer called maximum economic yield. Now, it turns out the new target, in fact, is win-win. It generates larger stocks of fish, so more tuna in the ocean. And indeed, the tuna are happy I'm talking today as well. I'm sure if they had a voice, they'd have me talking today about it. More tuna in the ocean, and more profits for people who fish, and in particular for Pacific Islanders who extract not only fishing profits, but access rights to distant water fishing nations. It's a win-win. It's something that I think needs to be done. And I'll try and make that clear. A little bit of context. Here we go. Just some background. Tuna fishery, 4 key species: skipjack, yellowfin, big-eye, albacore. The skipjack and albacore are the chicken of the sea that end up in cans. Yellowfin and big-eye are the premium sashimi tuna that's just absolutely wonderful. If you're in Cairns, go to a restaurant called the Cherry Blossom and order the sashimi yellowfin. It's unbelievable. It's incredibly fresh and beautiful. Can't get this in Canberra, needless to say. But if you're in Cairns, that's where you need to go. Most of those premium tuna end up in Japan, as you might expect, but in other parts of the world as well. Look at the numbers. It's one of the world's biggest fisheries, right? 2.2 million in metric tons, and it produces about $3 billion a year in revenue. just looking at revenue and not costs. The biologists will tell you there's evidence that the fishery is mismanaged still, even though there's quite a few policy recommendations being undertaken right now, or in the last 2 years or so. Certainly economic overfishing in big eye and in yellowfin tuna. And there's clearly evidence of what we would call biological overfishing in big eye, too much fish being taken out of the water. Just to give you a sense of what we're talking about, the little grayed circle-ish areas are in fact the economic zones that fish in this fishery, and clearly they cover most of the Pacific Islands in the west. The other legend tells you where most of this fish goes, and it's color-coded, so much of the fish in fact goes to Canada and the United States, Japan, the Philippines, Thailand, Europe, and other countries. If you look at who owns this fishery in a sense, if you look at access by coastal states in terms of the most valuable fishing grounds, PNG is by far the major player. It has the best fishing grounds in terms of access, in terms of harvest currently in the fishery. But others are also there, Indonesia, the Philippines, all the way down to the Solomon Islands. They're the ones who own and access, allow access, if you like, to those fishing areas. If you look at who in fact fishes in these waters, it's a bit different. Japan is the major player, along with Taiwan, Indonesia, all the way down to the USA. PNG fishes, China, Vanuatu, others. There's quite a mismatch here, a bit of a strategic game that you could talk about in terms of who owns and who actually fishes in this fishery. I'm just going to set that aside, if you don't mind, and not talk about that issue, although it's important. I want to get right back to the issue of the target. The thing I'm most concerned about. Think about it. Before you look at the slide, just think about what we're looking at here. It's an ocean fishery. There are tuna in the fishery. The tuna grow and they multiply. At the same time, there are people who fish. They take tuna out of the fishery. You want to ask yourself the question, what's the best way to sustainably harvest fish, tuna, in this fishery to keep the stock of fish at some reasonable level? And of course, what's meant by reasonable is really the key. Now, biologists prefer an MSY target, a sustainable harvest level that maximizes revenue from fishing or generates the largest value of sustainable catch in numbers or kilograms. It's standard for them to prefer this target. It's conservationist in the sense that you're trying to at least guarantee that there is a sufficient stock of tuna in the ocean so that you can always extract the maximum yield period after period. Well, that part's fine. The problem is it's not a very good economic target. It's especially not good if the cost of fishing doesn't depend upon the stock of fish, or if the cost of fishing, if you like, is simply zero. Because those are, in effect, equivalent statements in the models that I work with. So in other words, an MSY target would be appropriate, and this is the target that's being used in this fishery at the moment. MSY target would be appropriate if the boat drifts out to the ocean, the tuna hop on board, it drifts back, and the tuna march to market. It just is not going to work that way. You need to consider not just the revenues, but the costs of fishing to define the right target. And that's what this otherwise simple notion of maximum economic yield does. It's defined as a sustainable catch or effort level that maximizes the difference between total revenues and total costs of fishing. These are all discounted because economists like to discount streams of dollars through time. It's looking for the largest possible profit. Now, what does that mean? Why does it generate a win-win result? When you think about it, what you're generating here is what's often called a stock effect. It's good to have thick stocks of fish in the ocean. If you have a larger stock of fish, in fact even larger than maximum sustainable yield would suggest, every time you cast a net, or in this case drop a line, the cost of fishing per unit will be smaller. It's easier to find them, there's more fish available. And in fact, that cost effect really bites in most of these calculations. So it's not just the revenue, not just pulling fish out of the water and calculating the value of that fish. It's the value of that fish minus the cost of getting them in the boat or to market. And it tells you that if you're going to maximize profits, you should have thick stocks. You should have stocks that are very large. Highly conservationist, even more so than maximum sustainable yield. There's another good thing that happens when you do this, when you follow this MEY target, and I'll make this point a bit later. In the tuna fishery itself, especially in the tuna fishery, when you catch less fish sustainably in perpetuity, the price tends to be higher. And in fact, the elasticity is such here that in fact you can generate a lot of profits by cutting back in harvest, especially on the premium big eye and yellowfin tuna. If they could coordinate the Pacific Islands, they should adopt something like an OPEC mechanism for handling fish stocks in tuna, because you can really drive home a lot of profitability. The counter concerns, and I'll pick up at least two of these and the rest of what I show you, is of course the first and most important one. If you're currently overfishing, you have to move to a point where you get MEY stocks that are very large. You have to move to thick stocks. Well, that means you have to cut back on harvest now dramatically to build up stocks, to let fish grow and multiply until, in fact, you can reach the MEY target. That means you have to adopt the short-run pain to get the big gain. And in some fisheries, that can be an issue. We'll look and see what happens in this fishery. It also means that, in fact, there's generally speaking, although it's not always the case, there's generally speaking less employment in the fishing industry as a result of an MEY target. And we'll see what that means in this fishery. Those are the usual counter-arguments to this sort of target. There are others as well, but I'll leave those aside. One or two little graphs, and that will drive home my point. These are model outputs for the stocks of tuna in big eye and yellowfin if you adopt a business-as-usual target without pursuing MSY in these fisheries, compared to an MEY target. Now remember, the fishery itself is trying to pursue an MSY target, so business as usual, if in fact it can pursue that target, and there's serious questions about this, in fact won't be the right time profile for stocks in this fishery. But you can see there's a danger of these stocks running down over time. It's not unusual in the world. Many fisheries have this problem. The first fishery I worked in 1996, the northern cod fishery off the coast of Canada, collapsed in 1996, and it still has not recovered. You still cannot find any cod in that fishery. There is a danger here, if you're not careful, in 30 or 40 years of having similar sorts of problems in this fishery. But for now, you can see what happens if you use an MEY target. Initially, you have to build up stocks, because we've been overfishing for a good period of time. You have to build up stocks to obtain maximum profits. Right? You have to capture the stock effect to make sure that when you cast a net or drop a line, that there are a lot of fish available so that you can draw from them. Okay. Now, one more sort of telling diagram, and that I think will make the point. This is a little hard to understand at first, but not after you look at it for a bit. This is not model output. This is a representation of model output. This work is done using stochastic dynamic programming methods in a very complicated setting. This is the representation of that output. What's on the bottom here is stocks measured in numbers or tons or kilograms, whatever the case may be, of tuna. So you're measuring the amount of fish on the horizontal axis. The vertical axis is revenue from catch. And the blue line represents all the sustainable harvest levels. It's different values of revenue at different catch levels relative to stock. It's really actually easy to understand. It tells you, for example, if you leave all of the fish in the ocean, you'll get no revenue, of course. If you take all of the fish out of the ocean, of course you'll get no revenue, of course. Not sustainable, no fish left. So what's in between is different levels of harvest and revenue, trading off how much you catch, take out of the water, relative to how much fish grow and multiply. And that's why you get this trade-off. Maximum sustainable yield occurs at this point. Right? That's the maximum revenue you can generate. But again, it's not the cost that's being measured, it's just the revenue. Ignore the green line. The red line is the one that's most appropriate to the cost of fuel at the moment. The red line measures the difference between revenue and cost at that stock value for fish. Now, it's got a nice little curvature here. It tells you that the MEY value, how you maximize profits, is in fact at stocks thicker than maximum sustainable yield. Right? More fish in the water, the cost of fishing is lower. In fact, profitability will be quite a bit larger, even if the fishery itself could find an MSY target, which it doesn't look, or doesn't appear to me, to be doing. The actual fishery, the actual fishery is somewhere around here. It's fish down stocks, this is the case for Big Eye, fish down stocks, so profits are in fact much smaller than they should be, if in fact you built up stocks and followed an MEY rule. This is important. Economists used to be evil when it came to fisheries. They used to be viewed as evil, fish miners, go in and clear out the fish. In fact, if you adopt the right target, MEY target, economists generated a conservationist outcome, and a fairly strong one, for good reason. Okay, now a couple of those counter concerns and then I'm done. Incidentally, when biologists come to understand this, they love this concept, because they're naturally conservationist, and if they say, look, ooh, this generates even more conservation, I'm all on board. It was easy to get the biologists in Australia on board with this MEY target, and now all of Australia follows an MEY protocol. Not so easy to get fishers on board, right? Because you have to go through this transitionary period where you cut back on harvest to build up stocks. It means there's some pain. Let's look at what happens. Jenny, am I okay for time? Just a couple more minutes? 3 more minutes. Okay, good. Good. So, if you like, this is what happens if we could be at the sustainable point with MEY. But the question is, we have to move from this point, where we are, all the way up to this point. We have to build up stocks to maximize profits. That means some short-run decrease in harvest. You've got to leave the fish alone so that they can grow and multiply. Not completely, but you've got to cut back on current harvest rates. By our estimates, about 60% of current harvest rates in the fishery. So it's quite a significant cutback. Let's see what happens. What the next diagram does is show the change in profits if you move in this direction relative to business as usual. Okay. There we go. Thanks. Good. This is the net present value of BMEY trying to approach a target that maximizes economic yield relative to business as usual. And again, remember, business as usual is different now in this fishery since they're trying to pursue MSY. Everything slopes downward because economists discount. So dollars in the future are always worth less than dollars today. So don't worry about that. Except this is a bit troublesome. It tells you that discounted profits will be zero in about 35 years by business as usual, so that's an issue. But look at what happens. 2 things here. Initially, MEY is worse in terms of profitability relative to business as usual. This is because you're cutting back on current harvest. But over time, of course, MEY dominates business as usual in terms of profitability. Now, the good thing for this fishery, unlike many other fisheries where you're trying to sell this idea, is that this period, this difference, this fall in profit initially, and the time over which it takes to break even between MEY and business as usual is relatively short. 2 good reasons. Tuna multiply, grow quite quickly. You leave them alone, there are more of them. Second, if you harvest less, you generate a higher price for tuna, and your profitability in fact rises. So here's the punchline, Jenny, and then I'm done. If you want MEY in business as usual and subtract MEY in business as usual and subtract out the little bit of losses you have initially in the sequence, what's the dollar amount? Well, it's considerable. If you look over a 50-year period at a 5% discount rate, you could generate, following a BMEY target relative to current practice, at least $3.4 billion. Those are discounted values of future dollars to the present. In some sense, you could give back some of the aid, if you like. Sorry, Stephen. Apologies. Could give back some of the aid to the Pacific just by pursuing a target that, in fact, manages this fishery appropriately. I won't talk about employment. I'll bring it up in questions if it comes up. Thank you very much, everyone.